Okay. All right. So, welcome back. So what we're going to do in this next part is to look back at the 9.1 lab and see how we can use the new tools that we've learned in 9.2 to build a setting screen for it, and how to kind of interact with that and some of the bugs and issues that you may run into along the way with doing that. So we're going to start from kind of scratch. I know that you've already started on that 9.1 lab, but we're going to go back to the starter project and actually start from there. Okay, so you may already have a Hello Shared Preference folder project that you've started. Go ahead and keep that, but we're going to make a second project. So I'm going to go back to the starter repo. We've got the Hello Shared Prefs folder there. I want to bring that in. Problem is, if I bring that in directly, it'll overwrite the project or the code that you already have and I already have there. So I'm going to copy that folder to my desktop. Here. And I'm just going to rename that first. So I'm going to add live to the end, and then I'll go back and bring that into my project. And that way I'll have one that's called Hello Shared Preferences and the other one that's called Hello Shared Preferences Live. So I can bring this in here. Copy to projects. There we go. So now I can delete the one on my desktop. I've got this one, which is the one that I've already done, or that you've already started. And then I have this Hello Shared Preferences Live, which is the one that we're going to start with. And that should be based off of just the original starter project. Let me go ahead and bundle this up and post it in Discord just to make sure everybody's got a copy of that. I'm going to commit this first. 9.1. Push. Okay. I'm gonna clean this up. Zip, add archive. There you go. So I posted that in Discord, so you'll have a copy of what I'm starting with, just to be absolute sure that we're starting from the same place. All right, so I'm going to open up this project in Android Studio. New window. So if you would, once you get to this point, go ahead and ping in Discord and say you're ready, and then we'll get actually started with the project. All right. Alright, so I'm going to start going, and Essen, you can just pause until you're ready to catch up, and then I'll pause again in a bit once we kind of get to the next stopping point. So now that we've got this here, the first thing I want to fix, before we go too much further, is that on my emulator, you'll notice on the Nexus 4 that my buttons are cut off. right? Also, if I turn it into landscape mode, you'll see that this doesn't really work the way I'd like it to. So I'm going to do a few quick tweaks to make my layout work well on the Nexus S in kind of both orientations. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of looking at what's going on with this box in the middle. Okay, so if I go to the design view and I look at the box here, I can see that it looks like almost as if it's being forced to be square. Well, what's happened is they've set an aspect ratio constraint, which you can see over here on the right. It's supposed to be 1 by 1. So that's keeping it square. That actually creates a problem for especially smaller screen sizes. So I actually want to turn that off. Now, the way you turn that on is you normally click this little corner up here, and it's the same way to turn it off. So if I click that corner, it'll cycle through a few modes until eventually that will disappear. And now it'll be full screen. The upside of making that change is that it's going to work a little bit better in landscape. We haven't made all the changes to support landscape yet. There's another thing or two I need to do. The next thing I want to do is on the constraint layout, there's already some margin assigned. So if I look up here, they put a 16 dp on the whole screen. I'm going to remove that so I can reclaim that space for things. And you'll see that that's now expanded that area, this main text view, out to the edges. Because there's really no point in having that extra kind of gap in there. So that's what I'm going to do first. The next thing I want to do is there's some to actually make these buttons get smaller, and as well as kind of eliminating what looks like they're kind of offset right now. You can kind of see this is kind of at the bottom of there. This is all the way at the edge. That's down to some styling that they've already pre-applied. So if I go down to the buttons, you'll see each of these buttons, the 4 buttons here, as well as these 2 buttons here, they have a style applied. So the bottom 2 buttons have the app theme.button style applied, and those top 4 buttons have app theme.button.colored. Okay, so let's look at those styles. If I go to my styles.xml, so here's the style that's being applied to those 4 colored buttons. Here's the style that's being applied to the count and reset buttons. But if I look a little bit closer, I can see that this app theme button, this is actually a subclass of, or a substyle of the main app button, right? So this is actually, anything I actually set in here will be applied to all 6 of those buttons. So what I'm going to do, first of all, notice that they've applied some margin top to all 6 of those buttons. I don't actually want it. It's actually causing some issues. That's why it's being pushed down towards the bottom. That's why it's got these kind of weird gaps rather than being centered. So I actually want to remove this margin top. Okay, and just by removing that margin top, you can see how it orients a little bit better vertically. I still have the problem that they're kind of being cut off. And what that comes down to from kind of some investigation is that their minimum width and minimum height are a little bit higher than maybe that they should be. So if I look at them in the layout, I'll see that all of them are actually set to wrap content and wrap content for their width and height. So it's not because they're having some sort of fixed width or height applying. That's not the problem. The problem is that we need to change their minimum width and height, because that minimum width and height is forcing them to be a little bit bigger than they need to be. So in here, I'm going to add 2 settings. So I'm going to add an item name min width. So we're going to change the minimum width down to 70 dp. At least from trial and error, that seemed to be about the right spot. And then I'm also going to change the height. And this is the min height. Now, it is important to remember this is the minimum height. This isn't the actual height. So these buttons can actually be bigger than these settings, but this constrains it to say that they have to be at least bigger than this. But as it turns out, they're going to fall down to that minimum height and width here. So let's go run that with those styles applied. Okay, great. Okay, so now it works just fine on an XSS in a portrait orientation as well as a landscape orientation. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick fix to the project to get it in here so that it's not behaving oddly on an Nexus 4, because it doesn't seem that they really tested it for a smaller device. Okay. So those are the settings that I applied there. Now that we've kind of got it fixed and working, let's talk about what our objective is here. So if you remember from the 9.1 lab, there's two tasks looking at the lab. So the first task, they just asked you to to just explore around this project, to just check it out, see what's actually already happening. And then the second task was then to start automatically saving the count and the color to shared preferences. So anytime that anytime you left the app and came back, you would still have those two things set. And then once you finish that up, the coding challenge asked you to kind of do something interesting. It said, well, let's stop automatically saving it anytime that you leave the app. Instead of saving it every time that the user leaves the app, let's introduce some sort of setting screen that we've built ourselves completely from code and managed and yada yada, and then have the user kind of go to that screen and come back. But it kind of creates some interesting workflow issues. And the thing with where we're kind of at, well, 9.2 we talked about how to build setting screens, right? Well, here we're basically adding a setting screen in the coding challenge to the 9.1 lab. So I'd like to go through how I would add that setting screen using the tools that we learned in 9.2. Okay, so we're going to, in the process, have to deal with a few things in terms of life cycle. One of the things that makes this more interesting is that there is the saved instances. Saved instance state is also being used. So, for instance, if I take this app and I turn it sideways, let's say I set blue. Let's turn it up to 3. I want both of those things to be preserved when I turn it sideways. So in that case, I need to store it into saved instance state. I'm also going to end up actually saving it at that point to the shared preferences potentially. But I need those things not to conflict, right? So I want to say when I turn it sideways, that needs to be preserved. So there's kind of the state of the screen, but there's also the preference, the saved state that we're storing. So having those kind of two things interact gets kind of interesting and gets a little bit hairy in a few cases. So I want to go about how I might deal with some of these issues, but keeping a good workflow. So what I want to add first is the preference screen. We're going to add that preferences.xml, kind of design that, talk about the settings that we want to have there, and then kind of come back and talk about the life cycle and how to get the life cycle to behave the way we want. Okay. So I'm going to do this maybe a little bit backwards from where your 9.1 lab started. I'm going to start with the preference screen first and then work backwards. So on the res folder, I'm going to right click here. I'm going to say new Android resource file. And we're going to create a file called preferences. I'm going to set the resource type to XML. We'll see it's pre-selected the root element as preference screen. and XML is the directory name, this is actually going to automatically create that XML directory for us if we go this route. We won't have to create the XML and then the XML directory and then the preferences.xml file. This is going to do both. All right, so I'm going to hit OK. Okay, add that to source control. All right, so we've got an empty preferences screen. Okay. Oh, one thing I do need to do before I go too much farther, I probably should have done this already, is we want to make sure that we migrate this project over to Jetpack, over to Android X. So to do that, you can kind of do that the long way. You can do it the short way. I'm going to take the shortcut and use the migration tool that's already built into Android Studio to help me with that. So the first thing I need to do is I need to actually change the targeted SDK version. And it's kind of already suggesting to me here that I should do that. So I'm going to push it up to 29. I'm going to say we want to be able to compile for 29, and we want our minimum supported version to be 21. Okay, so we're going to just change those version numbers. 21 is the minimum, 29 is the target. I'm going to hit sync now. Okay, that's one thing you have to remember to do before you can migrate it to Android X. It has to be targeting 28 or higher, if I remember right. But now that it's targeting 28 or higher, you'll see that there's a red underline. Okay, so it says version 28 is the last version of the legacy support library. So we recommend that you update to the Android X moving forward. And you kind of see that it says, hey, by the way, the IDE can help you with this. Just use refactor migrate to Android X. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to right click here and we're going to say refactor. And then down towards the bottom, there's an option that says migrate to Android X. So we're going to migrate to Android X. Yep. Oh, and it says the Gradle version in your needs to be set to at least 3.20. So if you still have this prompt, this is going to be the easiest way to get there. It says plugin update recommended. I'm going to hit update. If you did dismiss that prompt earlier, the way to get there, you're going to right click on the project and say open module settings. And I believe you can go in here and change the build tools version. So let's change this to 2903. While we're in here, we might as well push this up to support Java 8. Okay, so those changes have been made. It looks like the migration, oh, I didn't confirm the migration. So I need to right click in here and refactor, migrate to Android X. No, I don't want to back up. I forgot to hit do refactor down here. That's what I'm missing. So I migrate to Android X, and then I need to hit do refactor. Okay, so we're good. It is telling me that it has moved it over to the Android X app compat, but there's a newer version. So if I hit Alt Enter here, it will go ahead and let me change it to 1.10, which is the newest version. It's also telling me that there's newer versions of JUnit and Espresso. This project doesn't do anything with JUnit or Espresso, so I'm actually just going to remove that entirely. Okay, so I'm going to go back down to there, and then we're going to hit sync. So your said configure failed. Dalton, what steps did you do to get into the configure failed? Okay. So in theory, if all this went well, that should have migrated everything over at Android X, and we should be able to run the program without issue. If something failed, more than likely it's going to crash as soon as we try to run it. But it looks like it's, on my end at least, it went through successfully. Now, if you haven't added it yet, you'll want to add this implementation preference dependency. Still failing when I try to sync. Okay. Is there any sort of error that you can post in Discord? If you can post any sort of error in Discord, maybe we can diagnose what your problem is with the migration. Screenshot of the error message or anything that would help. Okay, so if that's the error you're seeing, what I would recommend is rebuilding the project. So go to Tools, Build. You're going to do Clean Project, and then you're going to do Make Project. Clean Project and then Rebuild Project. And hopefully that will make that error go away. But it looks like it's looking for a file that doesn't exist or should have been deleted, but wasn't deleted. You may also want to go into the other build Gradle and check that this is class path Android tools build Gradle 3.51. The way that you do the migrating, you're going to right click here, you're going to go to refactor, and then you're going to hit migrate to Android X. So right click, refactor, migrate to Android X. Can you post a screenshot in Discord so I can see what error message you're getting, Alex? Okay. Okay. Once you get it migrated, make sure you can actually run the application. Yeah. The one part you need to make sure is you have the right Gradle version here. So here I have 3.53. So sounds like we've mostly sorted through those issues. I wanted to make sure I did that now because otherwise it tends to create issues kind of down the road as we're putting in preferences, specifically because things have been deprecated and things have changed. You're saying it's not syncing. Can you post, if it's not syncing, send me these two, send me what you have here, as well as send me what you have listed for your dependencies in the other Gradle. I want to see both of those things if it's not working. And we'll try and kind of figure out what we can. So going back to, so if we haven't fixed that at this point, then you'll get some issues when we try to do the preferences work, because it'll be trying to use the old preferences API. It'll be importing the wrong classes. Here's what you have. Okay, so so I think I know what's happening looking at your Gradle file. So if I go to so it says minimum supported Gradle version is 5.41, right? So if you look at your other Gradle file, the problem is that you have the wrong Gradle version there. The other thing that you're going to see here, you have appcompat set to 1.00. That needs to be 1.10 to correlate with the preference. So you'll want to upgrade this to 1.10. And you'll need to upgrade the Gradle version in the other Gradle file. So if you do both of those, then you should be able to sync. But what it's complaining about is saying that your Gradle version isn't right. It says currently it's 4.4, but the minimum that's supported is 5.41. Other than that, there may be another setting. App, open module settings. Oh, there it is. Project. So there's where I'm setting it at 5.41. Both of those things get automatically changed when you accept that little prompt about, hey, it's out of date. That's how I updated both of those things without directly going to that screen, but that's what happened. Okay, so we've got it updated to Android X. I want to now start designing this preference screen. Okay. So there's a few things I want on this screen. But let's start with some ideas. What do you think I need on my preference screen to support this app? Right? What are the things that I need to store? So color and the number, and if we remember, which is good. If we remember what we called them on the screen, what's already stored and saved instance state. For instance, if we look here, we can see that they're already being stored to the save instance state as color and count. Okay, so I'm going to save both of those things into the shared preference, which means I need a place for them. The other thing I want to do is to be able to test the workflow. I want to be able to turn the autosave behavior on and off. So if you went through the task for 9.1, it had you set it up so that in the pause, it would go automatically save those values to shared preferences. And then it told you when you got to the code lab to then turn that autosave behavior off. So I'm going to actually make that a setting. That way the user can decide to have it autosave or not have it autosave. And I'm going to use a switch for that. So I'm going to drag in a switch preference as my first setting. And then beneath that, so I'm going to use that to turn autosave on and off. I'm going to also add a edit text preference. That's where I'm going to store the count. And then finally, I'm going to have a list preference for the color. Okay. Now I can't drag that in right now because I don't have the arrays. So I'll need to create the arrays before I can put that in. If I do it through code, I can already start putting that in, but I don't have the arrays in there yet. So let's start with just the switch and the edit box for the count. Okay. So in the switch, I need to set that up. So we're going to set the key. The key for this is going to be auto underscore save. The title is going to be auto save. By default, autosave is going to be turned on, so I'm going to set the default value to true. I'm going to add this as the count. So count is going to default to 0. And I'm going to set the title to count. Okay. So those are my first two settings. Now you'll remember I also want to automatically show the currently selected count, currently set count in the summary. So I'm going to add use a simple summary provider and set that to true. Okay, so we have a switch to turn autosave off and on, and we have an edit text for the count. I do want to add in some summaries for the autosave setting. So when the setting is on, I want to set the summary on is going to be automatically save the count and the color. When it's off, I want the summary to say do not save count and color. So it's going to show this text when the switch is on. It's going to show that text when the switch is off. Now, I do want to extract all the strings here that are going to be translated. So let's go through and do that real quick. So the title for autosave, I'm going to extract that. And I'm going to save that as pref auto save. I'm going to extract count, the title here, as pref count. This one I'm going to extract these two descriptions. I'm going to extract as pref auto save on. And this one I'm going to extract as pref autosave off. At least in my experience, it doesn't seem to matter whether it's Android or app for most of these. It's kind of unclear as to which it should be. So I think that they should all be app, probably. You're probably right. But as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to make any difference regardless of whether it's app or if it's Android. With the exception of use a simple summary provider, this one does have to be app. Oh, no, that, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm just going to leave those as Android. So some of those are Android, some of those are app. So it's complaining that the select all on focus does have to be an Android setting. Yeah, so some of those are going to be Android, some of those are going to be app. If you're going through Designer, it'll kind of automatically pick which of those it is. I think part of that involves the transition from like the core preference API. So the ones that were already kind of part of the core preference API are part of that Android namespace, but the ones that they were then added with the new Jetpack library are under the app namespace. I believe that's the difference, but it's really unclear as to how all that works out. There should be a slash at the bottom. I don't know where you're trying to get it out. Oh, if the deprecated one, if it's still marking it as deprecated, that's because you're still missing this dependency in your Gradle. If you don't have that in your Gradle, it'll be still telling you that you're using the deprecated one. So that just means you're missing a dependency, so you'll just need to add that and sync it. Once you've extracted all those resources, this is what your strings XML file should have in it. So you just want to check that that all lines up. If you have that dependency and it's still complaining, I think that means you probably haven't synced. You probably either haven't synced or like you haven't synced successfully, or I'm not sure what other thing it could be entirely. Well, that's what I was going to say. I think that there's probably either a typo or it hasn't synced. It's one of the two, because if there's a typo, it may have just ignored that line. So back to here. So we've got those two settings configured. Now that I've added those two settings, I also want to add the one for the colors. Manually sync without that little sync button on the top right, because that isn't for me now. So what you can do is you can make a change to it. If you make some sort of change to the file, that will get it to show up, so you can sync it, and you can undo that change and sync it again. That's the easiest way I know to get that sync to pop back up. I'm sure that's somewhere else, but that's the one that I've had the best luck with. It's just making a change and then undoing that change. Okay, so I'm going to go back to, we've got the preference set up. I also want to add a preference for the color. So we're going to add a new values file. So I'm going to add a new values resource file. I'm going to call this arrays, 2 R's. Yep. And this is where we're going to store the options for our list preference. Gradle that syncs it. That seems familiar, but I forget where it is. Ah, there it is. Yeah, it's the one that looks like an elephant. Okay, so for the list preference, I need to add 2 arrays. One is going to contain the text that the user is going to see, and the other one is going to be the actual value that we're going to save. So for the purpose of the names that the user is going to see, I'm going to call that color names. That's going to be my first string array. I want to put that in like so. Now I don't have a default color string yet, but I have for each of the other colors the text is already there because it's already being shown on the buttons. So I'm going to add in those strings here, and I also need to add in another array which is going to be the values that we're going to save. Now I'm going to save the values as the name of the color. The other thing that you might consider or might think of doing is potentially, well, what if we save the actual color value, because that's what we're saving to saved instance state, and that's maybe what you had done when you work through 9.1. There's a lot of issues that I kind of try to work with. The biggest thing is that the list preference really does not want to store an integer. It really wants to store a string. So even trying to put in the color codes or the color IDs ended up in a way that I couldn't really make it work. So here I'm going to use these strings instead, because that did work, even though having the number for the color did not. Okay. So I'm going to put that in here. Default color, I want to extract that string. So I'm going to hit Alt-Enter. That did not work. Okay, so I may need to go to strings XML and add it manually. So in here, add in default color, string, name, default color, and this is going to be default color. So I'm going to add that to my strings XML and then refer back to it in the arrays file. So @string default color. So those are the arrays I should have. So these strings I'm going to refer back to in the code when we start putting that in, and we're going to do a translation between those values to the actual color code in the application code. Okay. Does everybody have these arrays put into your arrays.xml? Those are there. All right. So going back to preferences.xml, I can now add in that list preference. So with that list preference, add it here. List preference. Android, or this is going to be Android key. I want the key for this to be the color. I want the title to be color. I want the summary to be pulled from the current value, so I'm going to just use simple summary provider there. And I want the default value is going to be default, because that's the value I have in my string array. And then I just need to add those two arrays. So Android entries is going to be at array color names, and entry values is going to be at array color values. So I've got color names and color values. Okay. So there's my list preference. If I look at the designer, it should be there. Okay. So let's do, we've done a few things, but it's been a while since we've actually tested anything with this app. So I want to make sure that I can get to this screen and that those settings are being displayed in the proper way. So I'm going to go into activity main, and we're going to start adding a way to get to the settings screen. Now, remember, the typical way that I get there is I'm going to get there through a menu item. Okay, so to support that menu item, I'm going to go ahead and add an icon for it first. So I'm going to say new image asset. Action bar, I see settings. I'm going to pick the settings icon. Dalton, I threw the arrays into Discord, so you can follow up with them there. Okay, so back in main activity, oh, sorry, I need to add the menu. So we added the icon, IC settings. I need to add the menu. So I'm going to say new Android resource file. It's going to be a menu, and I'm going to call it menu underscore main. Menu underscore main, and it's type menu. Okay. So add the menu resource. I just need to add a single menu item to there. The title of that menu item is settings. The icon of that is IC settings. I want to show that as action always. So we've got a settings icon, and I need to go to the text and extract that resource. So Alt-Enter, extract string resource, and call that action settings. I do need to add an ID to that. So I'm going to give it an ID of action underscore settings. Okay. So we have a menu item for it. And I want to go to main activity and link it there. Oh, I can't link it there because I don't have. I'm missing something. I don't have a settings activity yet. Kind of missed that step. Okay, so let's create the settings activity. So new activity, empty activity. This is going to be the settings activity. I don't need a layout file for it. And let's hit finish there. Okay. So settings activity, that's the right place to start there. Okay. Go back to here. I need to create that settings activity fragment, settings fragment. So public static class settings fragment extends preference fragment compat. And then I need to hit Alt-Enter here, implement methods. We're going to implement the onCreate preference method. And inside of there, I'm going to call set preferences from resource. So r.xml.preferences, and pass in the root key as the second argument. Okay, so we've got our settings fragment. We've got the start of our settings activity. I need to remember to replace the main content of the settings activity with that fragment. So get support fragment manager dot replace, or no, dot begin transaction. Dot begin transaction dot replace dot r, or android dot r dot id dot content. Oh yeah, I'll need to fix that typo. New settings. Okay, so let's fix that typo here. Right click, refactor, rename. Settings, fragment, enter. Okay. Typo fixed. So begin transaction, replace, and then commit. So that's my settings screen. And now I can go back to my main activity and have the menu actually refer to that. So I need to implement two methods in main activity. I'm going to put all this code at the end of main activity. So I'm going to say on create options menu. I need to write 2 lines of code. I need to say get menu inflator dot inflate and r dot menu dot main menu. Give it the menu object, and then just return true. So that'll show my menu, and then I just need to respond to when the settings item is clicked. So on option item selected, I'm going to say let's get the ID. So int ID is equal to item dot get item ID if that ID is r.id dot action settings. Then I want to show the settings menu, otherwise we're going to do where the base class wants to do. Okay, so if it's the action settings item, then I'm going to start activity, create new intent. The intent is this settings activity dot class return true. Okay, so that should hook up my menu. Let's see if that works. Okay, hit settings. There we go. Oh, but apparently I forgot to set the parent activity. So I still need to set that. Okay, so let's go to go to the manifest, and let's change that here. I'd also like the title of the screen to be settings, so I want to change that as well while I'm in here. So Android label, we're going to set that to action settings, and we're going to say the Android parent activity name is dot main activity. And I'm going to add in the metadata for the parent activity. Preference fragment compat. So if it's not finding preference fragment compat, that definitely means that you're missing this dependency. It definitely means that you're missing the Android preference dependency. So you want to make sure you add that, make sure you sync it. If you then go back here, you may be able to hit Alt-Enter and it'll suggest that you need to import the proper thing. Because the import that it should be bringing in is this one, androidx.preference.preference fragment compat. So back to the manifest. That's what we want. I see the red underline, but what does the tooltip show on that red underline? Oh, yeah, that would be it. Yeah, so that would need to say replace there. That's correct. Because we were going to replace that ID with our fragment, we don't need to remove that. Okay. With people being at different places, it's probably worth us taking a quick break just to make sure that we can get everybody to the same place right now. So I want everybody to be at the point where you can get to you have the item here, the settings icon. That'll click and take you here with the up navigation. So please get to that point, and we're going to once you get to that point, we're going to take a quick break here and come back at 3:30 to do the next piece. So that's telling you that you have two resources with the same name. Okay, so if you look at the error message there, you're seeing that in arrays.xml you have two resources with the same name. In strings.xml you also have resources with the same name. All your files in, well, all your resources you can't have two resources that have the same name unless they're different variants. But in this case they shouldn't be variants. So what you'll want to do is pull up your arrays.xml and your strings.xml and look at what's there. If you double click on the duplicate resource message, it should take you directly to the line where you have duplicate values. I'm going to guess in your arrays XML, more than likely your problem's going to be that they're both named color names or they're both named color values. So what do you have that's off screen, by the way, Dalton? Because it looks like your resources goes down a bit. Oh, one possibility. It looks like you may have these arrays.xml. These two arrays, the color names and color vals, they should only be in arrays.xml. It looks like you may have them in both arrays.xml and strings.xml, and that would cause a problem. So if you should remove them from strings.xml and add them to arrays.xml. Oh, yeah, and you do have some stuff. So these two strings should be the only thing that's in arrays XML. Everything else should be strictly in strings XML at this point. The only thing you should have in arrays XML is arrays. You have the wrong attribute name. That's what it is. You have it as simple summary provider instead of use simple summary provider. Okay, so Jeremy, Alex, Dalton, did that solve the issues that you guys are running into? Okay. good. All right. Just hard to keep track with everybody at different places, and not necessarily easy to see your screen. But all right, so I think everybody's here. We've laid out a settings screen. We've got a place to see and pick the color. We've got a place to see and pick the count. And we've got a place to turn autosave off and on. So I do need to do a few things next to kind of start hooking up the settings. So what we're going to work with next is creating the actual application object, which is going to deal with kind of being our central point for accessing and managing the state. So let's add that application object. So I'm going to say new Java class. And why don't we call this the, I'm just going to call this my app. No fancy name, I'm just going to call it my app. All right, so my app extends application. So we've got our application subclass. We need to remember to reference that back in our manifest. So Android name is my app. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss those two errors. Alt-Enter, suppress that. Alt-Enter, suppress, allow backup. So that will make that not yellow all the time. Allow backup and Google App Index warning. So Android name is my app. And let's go back to the my app class. Okay. So in my app, I need a few constants. I need to keep track of the keys from the preference in this file. So if I look at preferences.xml, we'll see that we have auto_save, I've got count, I've got color. Those are the keys for those settings, those preferences. So in my app, I'm going to create constants for all three of those keys. So public, static, final, string, auto save key is going to be equal to auto_save. We're going to have a key for the other two, public, static, final, string. This is the count key. Count, public, static, final, string, color key. So those are the names of our three settings. Okay. I'm also going to add an instance variable to store the shared preferences object. So that's going to be a private variable, private shared preferences, preferences. Okay, so now that we've got our constants and our instance variable set up, I can now start laying out the onCreate method. So onCreate, when the application starts, I need to first of all save the default values to the preferences file if that hasn't been done yet, and then I also need to get the shared preferences object so I can read and write those settings. So let's start by doing first things first, preference manager dot set default values. This r.xml.preferences.false. So remember, this is going to initialize the preferences file, the shared preferences file, to have all those default values in it. And then mPreferences is equal to preference manager dot get default shared preferences. This. And make sure when it imported the preference manager, make sure it imported androidx.preference.preference manager, not the android.preference.preference manager. That androidx, that's what you need in order for it to be actually running off the Jetpack tools. Okay. And the compatibility libraries. Okay. So next thing I want to do is add some methods to actually be able to retrieve those values, right? So we have those three settings. I want the application to be able to retrieve the value of those settings whenever we need it. So let's start with autosave. Autosave is fairly straightforward. It's going to be a public method. We know that that's a switch, so it's a true or false value, which means it's going to be type Boolean. Okay. We're going to call that method getAutoSave. And then inside of there, I'm going to say return mpreferences dot get Boolean. Now it's stored as a Boolean. And I'm going to use my keys now. So autosave key, I'm going to use that constant. And by default, it's going to be true. By default, autosave is turned on. Okay. I also need to add a setting for the count. Now the count gets a little bit interesting. So let's write this out. So public, it needs to return an int. That is my end goal. I want it to return an int. Okay. So public int get count. And we're going to say, let's return mpreferences dot get int, and this is going to be count key. We're going to default it to 0. Now we're going to find that this doesn't work, and we'll see why. But the gist of it is when I'm using an edit text preference, same thing if I'm using a list preference, both of those things are always stored as strings. So if I try to call getInt here, I'm actually going to get an exception because what's stored there is a string, not an integer. Okay, even if I type it in properly as a number, we'll say I put it in as 5, this is still going to throw an exception and the application is going to crash. So let's see what happens. So I have these two methods created. I'm going to go back to main activity and invoke them. So in main activity, I'm going to go all the way up to the top, find the onCreate method. At the end of the onCreate method, there's a check here if there is saved instance state or not. And if there is saved instance state, then it's going ahead to try and load these values. Now, there's a few things going on here. First of all, it's saying, well, if the count is not 0, then set the text. If the count is 0, I want to set the text to 0. So I can actually remove this count. And that's just going to say, well, if it is 0, go ahead and set it to 0 anyway. Okay. So I can simplify that down there. But what I want to do is add an else case. And you'll see why I'm trying to simplify this logic in a minute. So in the else, I want to retrieve mcount from settings. So if there's no saved instance states, first time we've gotten here, it's not because we haven't gotten here because the user's turned the screen on its side. Then we want to load the count from the preference file instead of loading it from the saved instance state. So I'm going to say mcount is equal to saved instance state dot getInt and this is going to be, oh no, not save instance state. I need to get the application. So my app is equal to get application. I need to cast the application object as a my app object. And then I can use the app to get the count. So app get count. Okay, so that will get the count. If I just leave it there, it won't actually show it. So I do need to modify the text view to actually show that text. So I'm going to say mview.setText. Now, if you remember right, I can't directly show the count because otherwise it's going to treat that count as a resource value. So I need to take the count, turn it into string, so I can display that string. So string dot value of count. Okay. Now, realistically, both of these two cases, I'm going to need to update the number that's in the count as well as the background color of the count. So honestly, if I extract these lines out of the if-else, it's actually going to make it simpler. So I'm going to extract those two pieces here. So the only lines that will be left in these if and else is the logic that's going to load the count or the color. So in one case, if this is a configuration change and we're kind of resuming, then I'm going to load it from the saved instance state, the count and the color. And if it's a if there's no saved instance state, then I'm going to load it from the shared preferences file. Okay. And then finally, regardless of what way I loaded that data, I'm going to then have it display those colors. So I haven't put the code in to load the color yet. So I'm going to pull that from over here. Actually take this and move that into that block. So we're going to use the default color for right now if there is no saved instance state. Okay, so let's just give that a quick go. If I oh, right. So once I tell that to go, let me filter down to errors because you can kind of see that it crashed as soon as I tried to run the application. So it tried to go down here to app-get-count, and that didn't work out. So I'm going to clear the console. Let's try to run this again. Okay, there we go. So look at this. So Java lang string cannot be cast to Java lang integer. Right. So if I look at my app line 29 here, it's saying I cannot cast this string to an integer because remember my preference saved the count as a string. Okay. So what can I do to solve this problem? Right. What it's stored as is a string. It's not stored as an integer. So I'm getting a class cast exception. Question to the floor. Right. So that's correct. So I can try to read it as a string and then parse that string. So I'm going to say get string. Okay. Now get string needs the key, but the default value then has to be a string and not an integer. So I'm going to use empty string as my default. Okay. Now I need to take the value that I read and try to then parse it as an integer. So I'm going to say integer.parseInt. So I'm going to parse that string. Okay, let's give that a try. So use getString to read it as a string and then parse that integer. Okay, it runs without a crash. Okay, that's good. Well, what happens if I then go into the settings, and let's change this to ABC, hit OK. I'm going to go back. Oh, it crashes. Let's try to run it again. It crashes, right? So now I have my what I've put in the setting is ABC. It can't parse that. So when I'm dealing with parsing an integer here, as far as the settings concerned, I do have to be wary. Well, what happens if for some reason the user gets into a place where there's an invalid setting in there that's not a valid integer, right? Well, I don't want the app to crash. Ideally, I'd want to prevent the user from getting in that state in the first place, but let's just say somehow they got there, right? I don't want the application to then become completely unusable, because if the user's stuck in this place, well, they have no option but to uninstall the app and reinstall it. And they're probably just going to uninstall it and leave it uninstalled. So here I am actually going to take care of catching that exception. I've said that usually you just want to bubble up exceptions when you have issues with parsing. This is a case where definitely for sure, if my application setting is in a weird state, I'm just going to deal with that. I don't want the rest of the application to have to deal with issues where the settings got into a bad state. So I'm going to catch it and deal with it here. So I'm going to say try catch. I'm going to catch a number format exception. So if I get a number format exception, which we can see here is what's happening, then I'm just going to return 0. I'm also in the process just thinking ahead, well, what if somehow the setting becomes null? Well, if the setting becomes null, I might get a null reference exception as well. So I'm also going to catch null pointer exception and return 0. So if either of these two things are true, either it's a null pointer exception or it's a null number format exception, either of those two things, I'm just going to say, well, let's just return 0. And that way, if the user ever gets into a weird sort of place like they are now, then we're going to get 0 as the count, which is really okay. Let's say I change this to 1, 2, 3 now as the setting. Let's go back. Oh, great. Okay. So my setting's actually being loaded correctly. Now, one thing to be wary of, so this is working as long as I hit back, hit the up arrow, but if I go in here, say 4, 5, 6, I hit OK, I'm going to hit the back arrow on the device, you're going to see that that didn't load the 4, 5, 6. So it's loading it one way, but not loading it the other way. What you're trying to say, is that supposed to be finally or catch twice? It is supposed to be catch twice. So I'm saying I want to catch the number format exception, or I want to catch the null pointer exception. It looks like I can actually combine that there. So if you do have it set to, say, 1.0, 1.8 support, you can actually simplify that as such using a pipe. I'm just going to leave it that way. So you're getting a completely random number and can't figure out why. So one of the things that you may need to check and may need to mess around with, if you already started, assuming you already started with Hello Shared Preferences, it may be pulling that value from a previous install. So one thing you may want to do, Dalton, and anybody else who is having a similar problem, I'm going to hit the square, and I'm going to hold down on here. It's going to hit app info. I'm going to uninstall the app. Okay, and I'm going to run it again. So if you're getting a number that you're not sure where it came from, that may be something to try. is to uninstall the app and then reinstall it, and then it should get you back to a clean starting point. But yeah, this is supposed to be, to answer your question, Brandon, that is supposed to be 2 catches. So you might check that you're reading the proper setting. It may be that you're, for some reason, reading a color setting instead of reading the, yeah, it does look the max negative int or something of that sort. It may be a color code instead of the count. So one thing you may want to check is that you don't have an on-pause method as well that's trying to save it. If you have some leftover from like previous work on this lab. Okay. So that should be enough to get us kind of, so we've got started where we're saving and restore, we're reading, we're able to change the count in the settings and then kind of pull it back here. But if you remember right, the thing I was just looking at, we can see that this back arrow works, but that back arrow doesn't. It doesn't do the same thing in both ways, right? So you remember from the previous section that we talked about today, I did show a way to make those two do the same thing. So that's what I'm going to start with here. Is I'm going to make both the up navigation and the back navigation do the same thing. I'm going to make both of those do a back navigation. Although actually, that's my goal. I think maybe I should do one thing before. I need to do one thing before I do that, because I want to show another piece of kind of what you might run into. Okay, so we've got this started. I'm going to add a method for onPause. So onPause. So in onPause, I want to save the updated preference. I want to save the current value, assuming that autosave is on. So I'm going to grab the application object, and I'm going to say if app dot get autosave. So if autosave is on, then we're going to automatically save the color, the count, and the color. We'll start with just the count, but we'll come back to the color. Okay. Now, right now, I don't have an easy way to refer to this preference object here. I could go get another copy of it if I wanted to, but I want to have some way to refer to that, to do the save here. So I'm going to add another method to the application to save those settings. So public void save, I'm going to call this method save state. I'm going to take in a count and a color. So I'm going to take the two current values that are there, and I'm going to write some code to then save them. Okay, so I've got the count and the color. And remember, in order to edit shared preferences, I need an editor object. So I'm going to use shared preferences dot editor is equal to m preferences dot edit. So it's going to start the edit process. I need to save the values, and then I'm going to hit apply. Okay. So in editor, here's a good question. I want to save the count, right? Should I save it as an integer? Should I save it as a string? Well, if I save it as an integer, then we're then going to have the problem back here where now sometimes it's stored as an integer and sometimes it's stored as a string. So it's stored as a string if the user goes to the preference screen and changes it, but then if I then save it here, then it's stored as an integer. So I want to make sure that every time I save it, I'm always saving that setting at the same data type. So here, because the setting screen's saving that as a string, I also need to save it as a string when I save it through on pause. So I'm going to say editor dot put string, not put int, because I want to save it that way. Say count key, and we're going to have that then string dot value of count. So I'm going to take the integer count, turn it into a string, and then save that string. Okay, and then I need to call editor dot apply for that to actually be saved. Okay. Put a little fix me in here to save the count. Or save the color, because we haven't done that yet. So that should get it to save the count. I need to come back here and actually call that method. So app dot save state m count m color. So when it pauses, when the main activity is paused, it's going to save that state. If autosave is on, it won't save that state if autosave is off. Okay. Questions? So if I test this real quick, I'm going to bump the number up to 4. I'm going to go to the settings screen, and we can see, yay, it's set to 4. Okay. If I come back, it's still 4. Same thing if I hit the back arrow, it's still 4. So that's good. So our change here is at least it looks like it's being saved. If I turn it sideways, okay, cool. It's still being preserved through orientation changes. Now what happens if I go to the settings screen, change it on the settings screen, and then come back? So let's change it to 8. Come back. All right, so that's good. Let's change it to 16. And instead of hitting up navigation, I'm going to hit the back arrow. Okay. So it's working if I change it. If I change it on the, we still have that issue where if I go to the settings screen and change it and hit the up navigation, it works, but it doesn't work if I hit the back arrow. Okay. Now, you might say, well, maybe we need to have both of those ways do the same thing. What if we have them both do it the same way that's working? Well, unfortunately, that's maybe not ideal. So what I want to do instead, so I'm first going to I'm going to change the settings activity so it's doing the same thing as the back navigation. That's going to break it, so it doesn't work in either pathway. And then we're going to come back and fix it so that it works in both pathways. because otherwise I'm going to have a bit of an issue. Okay, so going to the settings activity, I'm going to say on options items selected, and I'm going to say let's get the ID of the menu item that's selected. So item dot get item ID if ID is equal to r dot Android dot r dot ID dot home. So that's if they hit the up navigation or the home button on the app bar, then we're going to handle that specially. So if they use the up navigation, we're going to call on back pressed and return true. So by adding this method in, it will work the same way regardless of whether they hit the up navigation, which will bring them back here, or if they hit the back. So regardless of which pathway they go, it will still effectively be the same as pushing the back button. And the upside of that is when they hit back, then it doesn't call on create, which actually is a good thing. May seem a little bit counterintuitive, but that actually is a good thing. We don't want to recreate the activity when we go back to it. We just want to resume it. Okay. Now, what that means is we need to handle that change somehow. Okay. So let's think about how we might handle that. If I go back to main activity, well, we saved the state on pause. Well, what happens if I say, okay, let's save it on pause, let's restore it on resume? That would be logical. That would make sense. So let's say on resume, and in on resume, we're going to reload the state. Okay. So grab the application, and we're going to reload the count. Grab the app, get the count, update the text to be that. Okay. So we saved it on pause. We're going to restore it in on resume. Let's see how this works. Okay. So it's right now at 16. I'm going to go to the settings screen. I'm going to change it to 32. Okay. Let's go back. All right, so it did update to 32. Let me verify that that works with the back button as well. So 64, okay. Hit the back button, okay. So it seems that either way I go, having put this code in on resume, that seems to have solved the problem, okay. That seems to have set it up in a way where if I go to the settings screen and change a setting and come back, it always shows the new value that I've changed in the settings screen. Okay. There is a case where this doesn't quite work. The question is, well, what is that case? Okay. Because there's a few things going on here. Okay. So let's say we turn this at, remember that the saved instance state is being also used to preserve the state, okay? And it needs to preserve the state when an orientation occurs. So if I'm on the screen, let's say I set it to 67, I'm going to turn it sideways, it should still show 67, okay? So that seems to be okay. If I turn it sideways, 67, it stays 67. Now what happens if I go into here, let's turn autosave off, because remember, right now I've got in on pause. If autosave is turned on, it saves the value. So what that means is when I do an orientation change right now, what it was doing, it was saving that value both to saved instance state as well as shared preferences, right? So if I turn autosave off, it's saving the value to the current value to shared preferences, but it's not saving it to it's saving it to saved instance state, but not shared preferences. So when I turn it sideways, let me count up. Okay, so I've got 72. If I turn it sideways, it should stay 72. And you can see that when I turn it sideways, it reverts to 67. It doesn't stay with the value that it was through an orientation change. Okay, so that's my problem, is sometimes it works on an orientation change, sometimes it does not. And the problem is a timing problem. Mm-hmm. So when I turn it sideways, I need it to restore that value from the saved instance state, not from the shared preferences. So let's reset, try this again. I'm going to count to 3, turn it sideways, got 2, and it should still be 2. Okay. So when I turn it, remember it has to destroy the existing activity. So when it destroys that existing activity, first it's going to call on pause. On pause, if autosave is on, does go ahead and save it to the shared preferences. If autosave is off, it's not saving it to shared preferences. So remember, what's in shared preferences with autosave off is still going to say this 67. It's not changing. So this gets destroyed. We're going to call on destroy, and then we're going to all the way come back with a new activity calling on create. So that new activity, we're then going to say, okay, do we have a saved instance state? Okay. All right, so far so good. I go into here, I have a save instance state. I load the state from the saved instance. I show that. We're good. A thing to remember that when I go through that restoration from a configuration change, not only do I call on create, I also call on start and on resume. So while it is loading the correct value here, that's then being overridden by my on resume. So when autosave is off, when this code isn't here that's saving the state, then I still have a case where things don't behave properly. Okay. Just to make sure everybody's tracking, you want to post something in YouTube, kind of I hope you kind of see what's happening here. It is kind of a weird case. Again, this only happens when autosave is off, because with autosave you end up having the same thing. So usually, a lot of times when you're storing shared preferences, we usually want to save them one place. We either want to have them be in the instance state, the state of the screen, or we want to have it to be in a setting. Not usually both. Okay, and if we have it only one place, if the setting is only in screen state, or it's only in a setting, then doing this with on resume and just loading an on resume is no problem. You're fine. The problem here is sometimes we want to load it from saved instance state. Sometimes we want to load it from shared preferences. So in order to handle this, I need to do something different. Okay, so rather than overriding on resume, and rather than solving this problem with on resume, I need to solve it differently. Okay, so I'm going to comment out my on resume method entirely. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a listener to listen for when the preference changes. And that will actually solve the problem that I'm having right here. Okay, so first thing I need to do is I need to tell this class to implement the proper interface. So implements shared preferences dot on shared preference change listener. Okay, so it needs to implement that interface. Make sure you get the name of that correct. There are some similar name listeners. We want to make sure that it's exactly that interface name. Okay, so I'm going to hit Alt-Enter. We're going to tell it to implement the methods for that. The only method I need to implement is this on shared preference changed. Okay, so that's going to give me a method down here, and that's where I'm going to handle the changes to the preferences. So kind of what I was doing in onResume, I'm going to do it here instead. So first things first, I want to check and find out which setting changed. So if my app dot count key no, not my app count key. So if this is the setting that changed, if the setting that changed is the count, then we're gonna grab that setting and update it. So we're gonna say mCount is equal to, well, here I need the application object again. One thing I'm going to do real quick to make this simpler, I'm going to go ahead and, because I need that application object in a few places, I'm going to go ahead and store it in a variable. So going up here, private my app mapp. Okay, so I'm going to create that instance variable to store it in, and then I'm going to add it in here. So mapp is equal to that. Get application, cast it to my app. So rather than asking for the application everywhere, I'm just going to do it once in onCreate. And that's going to simplify some of this code. So everywhere else where I'm referring to the application, I'm going to update that. So here's mapp, there's mapp. Here I can remove that whole line and say if mapp get autosave, mapp save state. Okay, simplify that there. I could do the same thing in the onResume if I wanted to fix that one up. Okay. All right. So coming back here, mCount is equal to mapp dot get count, and then I'm going to show that count. So show count text view dot set text string dot value of mCount. So I'm going to show the count if the count changes, and otherwise if the color changes, then I want to also update things there too. So if my app dot color key dot equals key so if you change the count or you change the color on the settings screen, I then need to update that back here. And this is where I'm gonna handle those problems instead of dealing with onResume. Okay, so specifically if you change it on the settings screen, this listener will be listening for that and update things on the screen accordingly. Okay, Now, if I just leave this as is, I haven't registered that listener. I have created that listener, but I haven't registered it. So I need to go back to onCreate and actually register that listener. Now, I do have one little problem before I can do that. In order to register the listener, I need a reference to the shared preferences object. But I don't currently have that. So I need to add a getter back to my application object to be able to actually get the shared preference object. So public shared preferences get preferences. I hit escape so it doesn't give me that suggestion. And return preferences. So this gives me a way to access that object so I can register the register listeners on the shared preferences object. Okay, so that gives me a pass-through there. Coming back to main activity, I can now use that. So mApp.get preferences dot register shared preference listener. So I'm going to register myself. And then I also need to remember to unregister myself when I'm no longer interested. So in onCreate, I'm registering the listener. And in onDestroy, I'm going to unregister the listener. So using that listener should deal with all of the life cycle kind of kookiness that occurs here. So let's see. So we have this. I'm going to reset it. I'm going to set it to 2 or 3. Let's go into the settings screen. It didn't save it right because autosave is off. So I can go there and come back. It's still 3. Great. Because that's kind of our state on the screen. But if I go to here, change it to maybe 34, and come back, there we go. So if I go to the settings screen and change it, that change will be reflected here, but it will still kind of keep the same state here. So reset to turn sideways. That's fine. So it only overrides kind of my instance state if I actually go to the settings screen and change something. Any questions about that life cycle? To kind of summarize how this is working, this is actually, when you're on the settings screen, this listener is actually active. So this listener is actually getting those events as you're changing on the settings screen, because it's still there, it's still active, but it's kind of put on hold, right? So we pause or stop. We stop the main activity, we go to the settings screen, and we come back. It's important that I registered and unregistered this listener in the onCreate and the onDestroy. If I had registered this in onResume or onStop and unregistered it if I had registered it in, say, onStart, onPause, it would only be running while we're on the main activity. And if I'd done that. I need it to be running when you're not on main activity, to be listening for events that happen on another screen, which is why it's important that I do the register and unregister and onCreate and onDestroy. Otherwise, that wouldn't happen. So what that means is, for instance, things that you want to update services, change configurations of services, you're going to do that, say, for instance, in the onCreate here. Say, okay, they changed a setting about the service interval. I'll register a listener in the application onCreate, and then reschedule the service in response to that change to the preferences. So that's where that really comes in. That's where this on shared preference change listener occurs, is when you need to update another screen or a previous screen as you're making changes on the settings screen. Okay. So that's the life cycle. The one last part that we have to do before we break is to get the color to actually be saved and loaded. The problem with the color is I can't save and load it as an integer. Okay. You might think, well, what if we save it as the ID of the resource? Well, not a good idea, because what needs to be in there in the string array needs to actually be strings. And we don't necessarily want to save the color code either, because we don't want to have sort of like, well, okay, I changed the color code in colors.xml, and now I also have to change strings.xml to kind of go with that. So if you remember how I set things up in arrays, I'm just going to save and load their names. Basically, the name of the color is what I'm saving to shave preferences, not the hexadecimal code. If I'm looking at what's being saved and loaded right now, this mColor value, that's the actual hex color, that hex value for the color. So for instance, if we go to on save instance, or no, it's when we click the button, there we go. So when you click the button, it's called change background. And that's going to actually save the color code. Yeah, exactly. So you're right, Alex. We need to have a getColor method that returns the proper color code, okay, based on the string that's saved. So what that means is, I'm going to go back to my app. I'm going to implement a method here, public int get color. So just kind of like with the count, it's actually being saved as a string, but I don't want most of the app to really know that. I just want to kind of hide that detail. I'm going to do the same thing with the color, where I don't want the rest of the code to really know that it's being stored actually as a string. I just want it to think it's actually being stored as the color code. So getColor is going to return that color code. Okay. So let's see, what do I need to do? Well, first of all, I need to retrieve the string value that's stored. Okay. So let's say we get the color string that's stored. I'm going to save that to a variable. So string color pref is equal to m preferences dot get string. So we're going to get the color. We're going to default that to empty string. So that's going to give us the kind of the name of the color that the users picked on the settings screen. Okay. Now I need to take that string and look up what the corresponding color code is. Okay. Now let's think about how we could do that. Well, the most logical kind of way to set that up might be with some sort of switch statement or a bunch of if-else's. You can do it either way. I'm going to go ahead and start it here with a switch statement. So switch color pref. So I'm going to switch on that string. If it is black, then I need to return the color code for black. Okay, so let's say I go here and I say return Android.R.color.black. Okay, and then I'm going to say case red return r.color.button.red background. I'm using those color codes because those are the ones that are assigned in the XML to the individual buttons. Okay, and come back to blue and green in a minute. I'm going to put it in my default case. So I'm going to say default return r.color.default background. Okay. So let's start with this. You're going to see in a minute that something's not quite right. It looks like it's returning the proper thing because I'm returning integers, so it's not giving me any sort of error, but there is an issue that's happening here. So let's go back, but let's hook this up first. So I'm going to go back to main activity. I'm going to go back all the way up to the onCreate. Where I say, rather than defaulting this, rather than pulling from the default background, I'm going to say mmap.get color. Okay. So if everything was working correctly, we should be pulling that value, the color, from the settings. It's not working correctly, so we'll see what happens. We have a little bit of a gray. Okay, that's the wrong gray. Let me go change it to, say, red. Okay, we go red back here. That's not red. Red again. It's still a weird color. So one thing that's missing, not only do I need to change it here to update the color, I also need to remember to go back to my listener here and grab the color from the application object. So mColor is equal to mapp.getColor. Show count text view dot set background color mColor. Okay, so same code that we have in a few other places in this class. So if you go to the settings screen and change it, we're going to change the color to black. Let's come back. That's not black, right? So you notice if I go change the value, it's not actually changing it to the right value. Okay, so it is changing it. There's red. We saw that. I'm going to go back to default. It's not getting us the right color. Okay. Now here's the deal. So in here, Android.R.color.black, R.color.red background, those are all integers. But the problem is they're all IDs. Okay? They're an ID of a resource. They don't actually represent the color per se. They don't tell us how much red, how much green, how much blue, which is what it's really expecting. It just says the ID of that color is 52 or 32 or sorry, 33 or 57. It's just the ID of the color. It's not actually the hexadecimal color code. So I need to actually do a transformation to get the color code back. Okay. So in order to do that, I need to have access to the resource object. So I'm going to save that to a variable here. Resources res equals get resources. I'll enter. And here, rather than directly returning the color ID, I need to call getColor on the resources and return the actual color value. So here this actually needs to be res.getColor. Same thing with the other two. So this is res.getColor, res.getColor. So I call res.getColor with that color ID, and that gives me the actual color value that I'm interested in. So there, that's black. That's red. Cool. And back to our default color. That's great. So I can add the other two cases in and check that. So red, green, and blue. Green, blue, blue, and green. Okay. Give that a quick check. So change the color to red and come back. Good. Change the color to blue and come back. And change the color to green and come back. So great. So I can change the setting on the settings screen and then come back and turn that back into a color code using this method. So resline is red for me and says qualifier must be an expression. Are you missing this line up top, Dalton? Where I created that res variable? Yeah, that would do it. So that's going to mean that we can change it in the settings screen and bring it back. But I also want this to work if the autosave is on, right? So let's say we go to here. I'm going to reset both of these things. I'm going to say 0. Get this back to our default settings. 0, default color, turn autosave on. I'm going to come back. Okay. Now, my expectation is if I change things on this screen, let's say I turn it to red, count up to 3. If I leave the application and come back, so I'm going to hit back arrow. It's going to shut the application down. And let's restart it. Well, we see that 3 was saved, but our red color was not saved, right? So I haven't put in code into save state here to save the color yet. Okay. So if we go back to save state, you see I kind of put that fix me in there earlier. So we need to actually take the color number and go back, right? So here in getColor, we're taking the string, turning it into an integer. We need to do the same. We need to do it in reverse in save state. We need to take the integer and turn it back into the string. Okay. So on the same kind of note, I need to have some sort of logic that does that. Okay. So again, I'm going to need the resource object to do that translation. I'm going to need to end up with a string, so I'm going to make a place for that. Color pref. And then I need to start switching or some sort of conditional logic to do the transition from saying, okay, if it's this color code, then it's black. If it's this color code, it's red. If it's this color code, it's green. Now, I can't actually use a switch statement for this because what's in here is I need to compare it with the actual color code, not the resource ID. So in order to do this, I can't use a switch in this direction. I do have to use an if statement. So here I'm going to say if the color is equal to res.getColor, our android.r.color.black. Okay. Then I'm going to say that color pref is black. And this res.getColor part, that's really important because it takes the, again, it takes the color ID and transforms it into the color code, which is what's being stored in this color variable. And that call is why I can't do this as a switch statement, because I need to call res.getColor. If I could just write it as color equals android.r.color.black, then I wouldn't need... then I could use a switch statement in this direction. But because that's not the case, I can't use a switch statement because my cases have to be what we call compile time constants. This here, because there's a method call, is not a compile time constant. It's not known at compile time. So that's how I'm going to write that there. We can then add all the cases for the other colors. So else if color is equal to res.getColor, and this would be r.id r.color red background, then color pref is equal to red, else if color is equal to res.getColor, r.color dot green background, color pref is equal to green, color res.getColor, r.color.blue. So if it's blue, else it's anything else, then it's default. Color pref is equal to default. And then I can actually save that value. So editor dot put string color key, and this would be color pref. So I use that series of if statements to take the color, the actual color value, and turn it into the string that I need. So if I say black, leave the app, come back, it's still black, red, leave the app, come back, blue, leave the app, come back, cool, green, leave the app, come back, cool. So I need to do a transformation one direction for the colors, one direction for loading it. I transform it from a string to the color code and the color value, and then when we save it, I need to transform it from the color value into the corresponding string. Okay. Any questions whatsoever? Any difficulties? So this has been a bit of a longer example. I hope that this has kind of put things in perspective more about the kind of different pieces that we've talked about in 9.1 and 9.2 and how to tie some of those things together, how to get, say, your saved instance state working with your shared preferences. Okay, I can do that one thing real quick. Yeah. So that's going to give us, a way to tie all those things together and to manage the state so that we can kind of navigate between screens and have the, change the setting on the setting screen. That then updates and is kind of matched up with the state on another screen. We have a listener in there now, listening for changes to the shared preferences, which is usually something you need to do to manage the state properly. But sometimes you can handle that by just implementing on resume. However, in this case, it's not so cut and dried. I also hope that you can see why I might want to put this code in the application class rather than putting it in the separate activity classes. That way I can kind of go and look and say, okay, how is this data being saved and loaded? It's kind of extracted away in the application class rather than my entire application really knowing the nitty-gritty of how my preferences are stored. I'd rather keep that in one place. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're missing there for sure. I'd have to look at look at this code. One thing you might try, maybe you want to switch on autosave. Maybe autosave is switched off. Maybe try switching that on and seeing what happens. Okay. Yeah, I can. I can take this. I can upload a copy of this to Discord, so you can take a look at it and see if there's anything you missed. But that's what we have for today. That really wraps up everything kind of for lesson 9. So tomorrow we'll be starting with 10.0. But yeah, I can upload this code to Discord. Okay. I'm not shutting down the stream here.